You could smell the corn husks soaking in the kitchen sink before you saw them. The water turned a soft amber, the leaves uncurled like old paper. And behind you, a wooden spoon beat lard against masa until the bowl rang. Your grandmother spread the dough with her bare hands, judging the thickness by feel, never by ruler. Number 17 on this list took your great-aunt 8 hours to fold, and she never once measured a thing. Number 22 on this list was the only tamale a widow in Veracruz could afford to bring to the wake. Number 9 carried a leaf you cannot legally import into the United States. These 25 tamales fed Mexican families through Christmas posadas, funerals, weddings, and Sunday afternoons that lasted from noon until the candles burned out. Hit subscribe and stay with us. Here are the 25 forgotten tamale recipes Mexican grandmothers made by hand. Number 25. Tamales rojos de puerco. A clay pot of pork shoulder simmered on the back burner for 4 hours until the meat pulled apart with the back of a wooden spoon. Doña Carmen of Tlaquepaque, born 1927, had been awake since 4 in the morning, toasting guajillo and ancho chiles on a comal that had belonged to her own mother. She blended the chiles with garlic and cumin, strained the sauce through a piece of cheesecloth her own mother had hemmed by hand in 1942, and folded the meat back in. The mesa was beaten with rendered lard until a teaspoon of dough floated in a glass of cold water. That was the test. If it sank, you kept beating. Simple. By midnight on Christmas Eve in 1968, 3 dozen tamales were tied with strips of corn husk and stacked upright in the tamalera. Nobody slept. The thing is, what most people miss is that the test for the masa is older than any cookbook. It's your grandmother's hands knowing what cold water knows. Number 24. Tamales de mole negro de Oaxaca. The mole alone took 2 days, 26 ingredients, toasted one at a time on a clay comal, ground on a metate that wore a groove into the kitchen floor where Doña Esperanza had stood for 40 winters in the village of Teotitlan del Valle. Black chilhuacle chiles, mulato, pasilla, almonds, raisins, plantain, sesame, a square of Mexican chocolate from the Mayordomo factory founded in 1956. The masa for these tamales was thinner than the northern style, spread on a square of banana leaf the cook had passed over an open flame, until the edges turned bright green and the leaf went soft. A spoonful of mole, a piece of dark chicken thigh, then folded into a flat envelope the way her mother had folded letters during the Revolution. People in Tlacolula said you could tell which family was hosting Christmas dinner in 1972 by walking past the open windows. The recipe was passed only by standing at the table. Year after year, you learned by watching. Number 23. Tamales norteños de puerco con chile colorado. These were the smallest tamales in all of Mexico, no thicker than a fat finger and barely 2.5 inches long. In Coahuila and Chihuahua in 1955, a grandmother named Petra Salinas would tie off 200 of them in a single morning, working with 3 nieces at a long table covered in newspaper. The masa was pressed thin against the husk, the filling almost overpowering the dough, pork shoulder shredded and folded into a sauce of chile ancho and cumin so dark it stained the wood spoon. Northern cooks looked down on the fluffy white tamales of central Mexico, the way you look at store-bought bread when your grandmother is in the kitchen. Theirs were tight, dense, almost meaty in the hand. They were your tamales if you came from cattle country, of long winter mornings on the ranch outside Saltillo, of grandmothers who had buried 2 husbands and never once stopped feeding the table. Number 22. Tamales de frijol de la viuda. In a little house outside Tlacotalpan, a widow named Doña Esperanza wrapped tamales in 1971, the day after her husband's funeral. because there was nothing else to bring to the rosary. She had no pork, she had no chicken. She had a pot of refried black beans, a half-pound of masa, and a stack of corn husks her sister had soaked in the sink overnight. She mashed the beans with a wooden bean masher and folded them with crushed avocado leaves for that anise smoke flavor her mother had taught her in 1934. Wrapped them tight, steamed them for an hour, carried 2 dozen in a cotton dish towel 4 blocks to the church hall. Nobody asked what was inside. They ate them anyway. Simple food, slow, with their hands, the way mourners eat. The part few people talk about is how often the simplest tamale is the one that says the most. Number 21. Tamales de rajas con queso. 2 roasted poblanos, peeled by candlelight under a wet kitchen towel until the blackened skin slid off, sliced into long thin strips the cook called rajas. A handful of Oaxaca cheese pulled apart by hand into pale strings. The masa was pale and fluffy, lighter than the meat tamales, beaten with extra lard so the corn opened up like fresh bread. Doña Lupita in San Andres Cholula had made these for 50 years, since 1958, the year she married a man who would not eat pork on Fridays. A spoonful of dough, 2 strips of poblano, a pinch of cheese, a small spoon of red salsa, then folded shut. These were the tamales for someone who did not eat meat that week, or for the niece who came back from the convent and stayed kosher in her own quiet way. The tamale of mercy, the family called it, never the tamale of poverty. Simple, effective. Number 20. Tamales de elote dulce. Fresh white corn cut from the cob with a paring knife at the kitchen window, the kernels piling up in a clay bowl, while a grandmother in Pátzcuaro hummed something her own mother used to sing in the 1920s. She blended the corn with a little sugar, butter, and cinnamon, and the masa came out the color of cream. The husks were the green ones, pulled fresh from the same corn that morning, soft and slightly sweet themselves. You wrapped each tamale loose, the way you wrap a baby in a cotton blanket on a warm afternoon. Steamed for 40 minutes, served with a smear of crema and a pinch of queso fresco, the salt cutting the sweet. In Michoacán, these were called uchepos. In the village of Santa Fe de la Laguna, they were just summer, the 8 weeks of August and September when the corn was at its sweetest. Number 19. Tamales de chipilín. The leaves grew wild in the hills around San Cristobal de las Casas, a small clover-shaped legume that tasted somewhere between watercress and spinach, and the grandmothers picked them in cotton aprons before the morning sun got hot. Chipilín is now classified as a noxious weed in some American states, which is its own quiet tragedy. The leaves were chopped fine and folded into the masa, turning it the color of pale jade. A spoonful of dough, a small piece of fresh cheese, sometimes a single shrimp from the Grijalva River, then wrapped in a banana leaf the cook had warmed over the comal until it gave like fabric. The Maya cooked them this way long before there was a Spain to import to. Now, here's the thing. The recipe is older than the word tamale. 40 tamales in a tamalera, everyone folded by Doña Esmeralda's hands, the same hands that had buried a daughter in 1979 and kept on cooking through every Sunday after. Number 18. Tamales de pollo en mole verde. A young chicken poached with a half onion and a clove of garlic, the broth saved for the masa. The mole verde was tomatillos, serrano, pumpkin seeds, a fistful of cilantro, and one of epazote, blended in a blue plastic blender that had survived 3 earthquakes since 1957. Doña Lupe in Cholula, born 1936, said you could tell a good mole verde by how it sounded when it hit the pan. "It should sing," she said, "not whisper. You'd hear it from across the kitchen." The chicken was shredded and folded into the green sauce until every strand was coated, then spooned into the dough and tied with a long strip of husk. 40 of them stood upright in the tamalera, packed tight enough that none could fall over. By the way, every Puebla family I know still uses a metal tamalera that originally came from a hardware store called Casa Sandoval that closed in 1998 and never reopened. Number 17. Tamales de mole amarillo de bodas. This was the wedding tamale, the one no machine could make and no shortcut could honor. In a small Zapotec village in the Valles Centrales of Oaxaca in 1962, the bride's grandmother and 4 aunts would start 2 days before the ceremony. They toasted yellow chilcosal chilies on a clay comal, ground them on a metate with cumin, allspice, and a single clove. Mole amarillo is not actually yellow. It is the color of old amber, of late afternoon light through a kitchen curtain, of a marriage that has lasted long enough to forget what the early fights were about. The masa was thinner than for any other tamale, almost a batter, spread in a paper-thin layer over a square of corn leaf. A spoonful of mole, a piece of chicken breast pulled from a hen that had been killed that morning, then folded into a small flat package the size of a postcard. 200 of these had to be ready by sundown on the wedding day, because the whole village was invited. Doña Soledad stood at the table from before sunrise. She was 68 years old that year, and her knees ached from the cold floor. She didn't sit down except to nurse a baby that wasn't hers. Her hands moved without her watching them, the way a piano player who has played the same piece for 60 years no longer looks at the keys. She had learned the recipe from her own grandmother in 1908. By the time the bride and groom walked out of the church under a shower of rice in 1962, the tamales were already on the long tables under the almond trees, 300 at a count, each one folded by hand. The grandmother washed the masa from under her fingernails with a sliver of jabon de coco and sat down for the first time all day. She cried a little, but quietly, where the children would not see. Number 16. Tamales dulces de fresa. Sweet pink tamales for a daughter's first communion in a parish church in El Paso in 1974. The masa was tinted with a few drops of cochineal red Doña Aurora had dissolved in warm water, the color settling into the dough like a slow blush. Strawberry preserves stirred with a stick of cinnamon and a handful of raisins folded in for sweetness. A few slivered almonds, sometimes a spoonful of crushed pineapple if a neighbor had brought one back from Veracruz. Wrapped in a corn husk that had been soaking since the night before, tied at both ends with a thin strip of the same husk, then steamed alongside the savory tamales, so the kitchen smelled of pork and chile and strawberry all at once. A pink tamale on your white communion plate next to your cup of hot chocolate. The little girl in the lace dress remembers it 40 years later. Better than she remembers what the priest said. You can still smell it, 40 years on. Number 15. Tamales de capirotada. A grandmother named Doña Cecilia in Guanajuato during Lent in 1968 turned leftover bolillo bread into something almost holy. She tore the stale bread into chunks, soaked them in piloncillo syrup with cinnamon and clove, and folded the soft sweet bread into masa with raisins, peanuts, and a few pieces of aged cheese. The whole tamale was bread pudding wrapped in a corn husk, steamed until the bread fell apart inside the dough and the cheese melted in pockets. Capirotada itself is the Lent dessert that symbolizes the body and blood of Christ. Her mother had done it during the Cristero War in 1928, when there was no priest left in town. Her grandmother had done it during the Revolution in 1914. It wasn't written down. The recipe was written nowhere. It lived in the hands of 3 generations of women who had each learned it the same way, by standing at a table on Ash Wednesday and watching. Number 14. Tamales de costilla de res. Beef rib tamales were the Sunday tamales in the cattle country of Sonora. Doña Hortensia from Magdalena de Quino, born 1939, would buy 3 pounds of short ribs at the carniceria on Saturday morning, simmer them all night in a pot of water with bay leaf, garlic, and a single dried chiltepin pepper from the desert, the meat falling off the bone by sunrise. She shredded the rib meat with her fingers, folded it into a sauce of guajillo and chile de árbol that her husband used to call the black sauce, even though it was deep red. The masa was beaten with the rib broth instead of water, which gave it a richness no chicken broth could match. By 1985, she was making 40 of these every Sunday for grandchildren spread across 3 border towns. Number 13. Vaporcitos Yucatecos. Down in Mérida, Doña Maria Canul would set up her kitchen at 5 in the morning the day before a child's birthday party. Vaporcitos were the Yucatecan tamales, the centerpiece of what every Mayan family called the plato de fiesta. The masa was thinner than the central Mexican kind, fragrant with achiote that had been ground on a stone with sour orange juice the night before. The filling was turkey or pork, simmered in recado rojo until it stained the cook's fingertips a soft brick red. Each tamale was wrapped in a square of banana leaf the cook had warmed over the open flame of a butane stove until the green deepened. They were small and flat, packed 40 to a tamalera. Your Yucatecan party in 1981 without vaporcitos. Not a party. Simple as that. She had been making them since she was 12, since her own mother set her at the table in 1948 and showed her how to fold the leaf without tearing. Number 12. Tamales de hoja santa. The leaf is enormous, heart-shaped, fragrant somewhere between anise and root beer and pepper, and it does not grow north of the Mexican border in any meaningful quantity. A grandmother in Papantla, Veracruz, named Doña Ramona, would pick the leaves from the bush by her back wall in 1965, rinse them in the sink, and lay them flat on the kitchen counter. A spoonful of masa, beaten with extra lard. Simple. A piece of pork, or a small fillet of fresh fish from the Tecolutla River. A pinch of salt. The leaf was folded around the dough like a green envelope, then wrapped again in corn husk so the steam could not unwrap the leaf. 40 minutes in the tamalera and the masa took on the wild scent of the leaf itself. By 2015, the bush by Doña Ramona's back wall was gone, dug up by a developer who built apartments on the lot. Number 11. Tamales de las Chili Queens. From the 1860s until the early 1940s, the women called the Chili Queens set up tables under oil lamps in the plazas of San Antonio every night at sundown. They cooked chili con carne, enchiladas, and tamales over mesquite fires in Military Plaza and Haymarket Plaza. The tamales were small, tight, filled with shredded pork in a guajillo sauce, so spicy that visitors from Boston wrote letters home about their tongues. A San Antonio cook named Graciela Sanchez's great-grandmother saved enough money from selling tamales in Military Plaza in the 1890s to buy a house on the south side. In 1943, the city health department closed the stands for what they called unsanitary dishwashing, which everybody knew was a different word for what it really was. Here's what survived. The recipes lived on in the home kitchens of South Texas, in grandmothers who had learned them from grandmothers who had cooked outside under the lamps. Number 10. Tamales de Zacahuil, the biggest tamale in all of Mexico. In the Huasteca region of Veracruz and San Luis Potosí in 1958, a single zacahuil could measure 5 feet long and weigh 40 pounds. It took 6 people to make and a wood-fired adobe oven the size of a doghouse to cook. Coarsely ground masa was mixed with rendered lard, then spread on layer after layer of fresh banana leaves the family had cut from the back garden that morning. A whole pig, a turkey, sometimes both, was laid in pieces along the masa with a sauce of cascabel and chiltepin chilies. The whole thing was wrapped, tied with rope and wire, and cooked in the oven for 8 to 10 hours. One zacahuil fed 60 people at a wedding in the village of Aquismon. By 2020, there were maybe a dozen women in the whole region who could do it from memory. Number 9. Tamales de Brazo de Reina. The name means queen's arm, because the finished tamale is shaped like a thick rolled log instead of a small bundle. This is the tamale of Mayan Yucatan, made for Holy Week and for the harvest ceremony the old people called huajicol. The Mayan name is zotobichay, which means corn dough cooked with chaya. The masa is folded with cooked chaya leaves, that wild Mayan green that tastes a little like spinach but stronger and grassier. Doña Mirna in the village of Señor would spread the green dough on a wide banana leaf the length of her forearm, scatter ground pumpkin seeds across the surface like sand, lay slices of hard-boiled egg down the center, then roll the whole thing up tight. Steamed for an hour, sliced like a loaf, served with a tomato sauce her mother used to call chiltomat. The grandmothers who still cook them in Mérida in 2024 know they're the last link. The simple truth is, you can't replace them. Number 8. Tamales de pollo and mole rojo. Red mole is the everyday mole, the one Doña Petra in San Pedro Cholula made on a Tuesday in 1973, because somebody was coming to dinner. Guajillo chiles toasted on the aufis, comal, ancho chiles soaked in hot water, almonds, peanuts, a small piece of cinnamon, 2 cloves, a square of bittersweet chocolate from Tabasco. Blended smooth, strained, simmered until it coated a spoon. The chicken was simmered separately with onion and bay leaf, shredded, folded into a small bowl of the mole. The masa was beaten with broth and lard until light. A grandmother in Puebla would make 60 of these on a Sunday morning before the family arrived for comida at 3 in the afternoon. The leftovers became tamales for breakfast on Monday, wrapped in foil and toasted on the comal until the husks smelled like roasted corn. Doña Petra kept making them every Sunday until 1998. Then her hands gave out. Number 7. Tamales de coco. Coastal tamales from Guerrero and Colima, sweet, made with grated fresh coconut, a little sugar, a pinch of salt. The masa was beaten with coconut milk instead of water, which made it almost white and slightly perfumed. Inside a spoonful of grated coconut, a few raisins, sometimes a small square of pineapple. Wrapped in corn husk, steamed, eaten warm with strong coffee on a humid afternoon when the breeze came off the Pacific. Doña Inés in Acapulco, born 1944, made these for her grandchildren on Saturdays in the 1970s and 1980s because the children would not eat your savory tamales, but they would eat anything sweet. Coconut tamales were also the wake tamale in some coastal villages south of Zihuatanejo. It's a kindness. They were a kindness given in a small white wrapper, eaten without ceremony. The husk dropped quietly into a basket by the door. Number 6. Tamales de pollo and chile verde. Doña Carolina in El Paso in 1962 made these every Saturday morning for her 7 grandchildren. She poached a whole chicken in salted water, pulled the meat from the bones with her fingers while it was still warm, and folded it into a sauce of fresh tomatillo, serrano, garlic, and a few sprigs of cilantro from the pot in her kitchen window. The sauce was bright and sharp, a green that almost glowed in the pot. The tamales were small, tied at both ends. She steamed them in a tamalera that had once belonged to her own mother in Ciudad Juarez in 1928. Each grandchild got 2. You waited your turn. The leftovers went into a bag for the elderly neighbor who had no family in town, an old man named Don Eulalio, who had crossed the river in 1947 and never gone back. She did this every Saturday for 31 years, every single one. After she died in 1993, the neighbor stopped opening his front door on Saturday mornings. Number 5. Tamales de Dia de los Muertos. The corn husk is the shroud, the masa is the body, the filling is what remains. In some villages in Oaxaca, special tamales called tamales de muerto were made only for the altar, never to be eaten by the living, only laid at the foot of the photograph of the person who had died that year. A grandmother named Doña Catalina in San Pedro Cajonos would prepare them in the dark of October 31st, while the marigolds wilted on the threshold and the candles burned low. Mole negro, a small piece of turkey thigh, folded into a banana leaf. The smell drifted out the open door and was meant to be the trail the dead followed home. It's still done that way. Doña Catalina did this every year from 1949 until 2011. After she died, her daughter took over and never missed an October. Number 4. Tamales de capón de boda, the Zapotec wedding tamale of the second day. The one served the morning after the ceremony when only the close family was left, and the long table outside had been cleared and reset. Capon meant a young rooster that had been castrated and fattened for 40 days. The meat sweeter and more tender than any chicken. Doña Soledad in Teotitlan would have killed the bird 3 days before, simmered it slowly with garlic and cumin, shredded the meat, folded it into a thick sauce of mole rojo. Each tamale was small, dense, almost a closed fist of corn and meat and chile. They were eaten with strong coffee and a little aguardiente, and the bride and groom sat at the head of the table looking tired and slightly stunned. You won't see this anymore. In 1962, 60 people sat down to that breakfast. By 2010, the same wedding would have drawn fewer than 20. Number 3. Tamales de Chile Colorado de Nuevo Mexico. Across the border in northern New Mexico in the 1950s, in small villages like Chimayo and Truchas, a grandmother named Adelita Romero would dry her own red chilies on long ristras hanging from the porch beam. By December, the chilies were leather and ready. She ground them in a small stone molcajete, simmered them with garlic, cumin, and pork shoulder until the sauce was the color of rust. Tamales were made for the Christmas Eve farolitos walk through the village, when every adobe wall was lined with brown paper bags holding small candles. Children carried tamales in wax paper to the neighbors. Adelita Romero kept that recipe alive from 1947 until she stopped cooking in 1989. Her granddaughter still makes them every December using the same molcajete. Simple, beautiful. Number 2. Tamales de chile dulce con pasitas. Sweet tamales for the Three Kings Day breakfast on January 6th, when the children opened the small gifts the wise men had left in their shoes. The masa was sweetened with brown sugar and a little ground cinnamon. The filling was a thick paste of poblano chile that had been stewed slowly with raisins, almonds, and a spoonful of piloncillo until the heat of the chile and the sweetness of the sugar met somewhere in the middle. Doña Refugio in Mexico City, born 1928, would wrap them in corn husks tied with a small ribbon for the holiday, and the children unwrapped them like presents, sweet and savory and warm, eaten with hot chocolate beaten with a wooden molinillo until the foam stood up an inch above the cup. Doña Refugio kept it alive every January 6th from 1955 until 2001. You could taste the cinnamon for hours afterward. Number 1. Tamales de Nochebuena. The Christmas Eve tamales. Here's the night. In 1,000 Mexican-American kitchens from Los Angeles to South Texas to Chicago in 1976, this was the night the whole family gathered. Aunts, mothers, grandmothers, the older daughters, sometimes a niece who had flown in from Seattle and did not really know how to spread the masa but learned by watching. They sat at the long table and worked from afternoon until midnight. 200 tamales in pork, chicken, sweet pink, rajas con queso. The grandmother held court at the head of the table. She did not spread masa anymore. Her hands were too tired. She'd done it for 60 years. But she watched every fold, corrected every wrap, and tasted every batch of mole before it touched the dough. Afterward, they came home from midnight mass and ate the tamales standing at the kitchen counter, the steam rising into the cold December night through the open back door. The grandmothers who made these tamales by hand are mostly gone. Kitchens are smaller, families spread across more area codes, and the tables on Christmas Eve are shorter every year. But in Houston last December, a granddaughter called her mother on speakerphone to ask exactly how thick the masa should go on the husk. In Phoenix on January 6th, a daughter wrapped sweet pink tamales for her own little girl. In Los Angeles, a 30-year-old woman pulled a tamalera down from her pantry, the one her abuela left her, and started soaking corn husks in the sink. The tradition didn't die, it just learned to live in fewer hands at a time. The recipe works,